Before we begin, I want to first acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. Well, welcome to another edition of the University of Minnesota History Book Club. I'm Sarah Chambers, the chair of the History Department, and I'm really pleased to have you all joining us this evening. This is an opportunity for us once a month to gather and feature a book that's been published by someone on our faculty or an alumnus. And we've had some really great conversations. So the way it works, as many of you know, is we'll start with a brief presentation from our editor and translator, in this case, of the book today, not the author, who is no longer with us. Then they will have a conversation. We'll invite another person to come in, and then towards the end, there'll be a chance for questions from the audience. So you can be thinking of your questions and putting those in the chat. And we have Clayton Smith standing by in case we need him for any sort of technical difficulties. And I'll apologize for my kind of awkward looking headset today, but the system on my internal MacBook has gone out. So I have to plug in an external mic and speaker. So again, it's really a pleasure to welcome you today to what will be not just a conversation about a book, I think, but a journey into the past and into the rugged landscape of the Alps, guided by three wonderful guides to this. So the book that we're featuring today is Theuerdank, the illustrated epic of a Renaissance knight, that has just been translated into English by Jonathan Green, who teaches German at the University of North Dakota, and edited and with an introduction from professor in our history department, Howard Lauthen, who's also the director of the Center for Austrian Studies here at the University of Minnesota. And then in the conversation section, they will be joined by Elaine Tennant, who's professor emerita of German at the University of California, Berkeley, and as you can see from her background, the former director of the Bancroft Library there at Berkeley. And she brings a wonderful perspective as someone who is very familiar with these early modern books and printing, and the way in which the book that we're dealing with today is not only a story, but it's an illustrated epic, and the printing is so important to that. So let me turn things over to Howard and Jonathan to tell us about how this project got started and provide some context for us.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for that kind introduction, and thank all of you for joining us for this new edition of the book club. And we're absolutely delighted to share with you about, some information about this fascinating text. Now, we have two major objectives with our introductory comments. The first is to tell you, what is this Theuerdank? What is this book that we're talking about and so excited about? And secondly, which we'll sort of work into our introduction as well, why is it important? Why is it significant? What does it do? And what does it help us understand better? This project, talking about its origins, is really distinctive in the sense that it really grew out of what I saw as the needs of the classroom. So it's intimately connected with really pedagogical concerns. Now, I normally describe myself and my specialty as I work on early modern Central Europe, which I think is a horrible moniker especially for those outside the field. What is Central Europe? Where is Central Europe? What's the early modern period? Now, we used to use the term sort of Renaissance and Reformation to describe this period as well. And I think Renaissance gets at one of the challenges that we were dealing with when we worked on this project. Now, I think most of us, at least in the popular imagination, when we think about Renaissance, our mind naturally and justifiably goes to Italy. And we think about Florence and the accomplishments of the Medici family, or Rome and the nefarious machinations of the Borgia clan, who have the levers of power of the Vatican that they're manipulating, or the cultural achievements of artists like Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, but not so much Central Europe. If our mind goes outside of Central Europe or outside of Italy, we may think of England, the Tudor family, but that is, I think, really the extent of many times of our at least our natural images when we think about the Renaissance. The world of sort of the deep forests and small villages of Central Europe are often sort of outside our radar screen or outside our cultural imagination of the Renaissance. And this project gets at one of those issues, because it opens up and introduces us to this fascinating world of Renaissance Central Europe. Now, the second and related sort of issue behind the origins of this project, I think, speak to how we teach in the classroom. Now, I and many of my colleagues, we put an emphasis on working with primary sources. And there are sort of marvelous primary sources that introduce this area that we would like to use in the classroom. Unfortunately, many of them are not available in English. And so I have punctuated my own career with a couple of these sort of translation projects of texts that might be useful for the classroom, that really, I think, open up a world to a general public who may not be familiar with this really wonderful, intriguing era and place. And Theuerdank checks off a lot of those boxes. It's a text that has long been hailed by specialists as a masterpiece of the German Renaissance. In the classroom, it's an adventure story, as we'll hear. It's a story of boy gets girl, or tries to get girl, and has to go through a whole series of adventures in that process. And also in this age of media, this maybe golden age of the graphic novel, we encounter we can talk about this, what might be roughly described as a Renaissance graphic novel, because this story is accompanied with over 100 woodcuts from leading artists of the period that are absolutely fascinating to explore and look at. So before we actually talk about the text itself, I think it's also very important to highlight its patron, because we really can't understand Theuerdank outside its context. And here I'd like to, let me share screen briefly, highlight one individual right here that I think we can see. If we can. The Habsburg Emperor, Maximilian I. In this age of Renaissance, of all these colorful figures, the Medici popes, Henry VIII, I think it's arguably Maximilian I, this Habsburg emperor, who is known certainly to specialists, but not so much to a broader public, is really one of the most fascinating, maybe the most fascinating figure of this period. He's a larger than life figure with outsized ambitions. Just to give you one example, when one of the current popes at the time was ailing, Pope Julius II, Maximilian had a plot to actually, were Julius to pass, to get himself elected as Pope, and in one person combine the office of Pope and Emperor, which I think is a good barometer of the type of projects that this man sponsored. An absolutely wild, over-the-top imagination, and he had all sorts of interesting interesting cultural projects that he pursued throughout his career. Now, there was only one problem with that. This man with great ambition was actually, we'll stick with the map here, and we'll stick with our images, and let's see if I can highlight this map perhaps a little bit better here, make it a little bit bigger. This man with outsized ambitions had limited resources. Here you see a map of the Habsburg holdings in the age of Maximilian. And let me highlight 2 points. First is, this is Emperor Maximilian, but it's important to remember that this title of emperor was elective. You had to be voted into office, and it did not pass automatically from father to son or stay in the family. So that's the first thing. It was a position of limited power. The second thing is that the Habsburgs themselves were their power base, which is in the darker shaded areas right there in Central Europe, was relatively modest and scattered. You can see this collection of territories in Central Europe from which they sort of base themselves. So we have the classic situation where great ambition collides with limited resources. And I think Theuerdank is, in some respects, so fascinating and so important because it reflects Maximilian's strategy to deal with this situation. And here I want to highlight 2 aspects of his strategy. And for the sake of simplicity, I have 2 points, both beginning with the letter M. The first is memoria, or memory, or in German, Gedächtnis. Maximilian was a brilliant propagandist. He was able to use the arts, both the new arts, printing, but traditional arts as well, to celebrate the achievements and exploits of his family. And even when it wasn't maybe such a great achievement, to hype it a little bit better in print and paint and metal, however he celebrated this achievement. But of all the Renaissance princes, I don't think any used the new print media more effectively than Max. So that was very, very important. So this notion of memoria. The second issue that I want to highlight is marriage. Power and dreams of power are fine, but without resources behind them, it's not going to go very far. And one of the great events in the history of the family, and a real turning point for the Habsburgs, occurred in 1477, when Maximilian married the most important heiress in all of Europe at the time, and that was Mary of Burgundy. And you can see the territory that Mary controlled in sort of the lighter sharing. Mary brought with her an incredibly sophisticated, if you just recognize that geography, a sophisticated, powerful, and very, very wealthy territory of the Burgundian lands. And it not only gave Maximilian the financial resources, but it also gave him the sort of cultural patrimony to from which to continue his campaign of burnishing the image of his family. So with that said, I think that Theuerdank, and as I said, in many respects, highlights both these aspects of Maximilian's sort of strategy for the family, both the marriage politics. It's a story that recounts this adventure of a boy meets girl, boy gets girl, and also a way to celebrate the family. And I'll stop sharing right now, and I will turn it over to my very able and all too modest translator, Jonathan Green, to tell a little bit about the text itself and to give you a little bit more background of what Theuerdank is about.
Okay, thanks, Howard. I am going to now hide behind a bunch of images, but if we're going to talk about an illustrated work, it makes sense, I believe, to let you see what those images are. And so hopefully you are seeing one of them right now. And so it's not too difficult to summarize the story that we find in Theuerdank. Essentially, the story is, it starts with the death of King Romreich, who leaves his daughter, Queen Ehrenreich, to rule the land. And he also leaves behind instructions that she should marry Prince Theuerdank. The only problem is nobody knows in what land Prince Theuerdank lives. And so an envoy is dispatched to locate him. Meanwhile, three of the territorial lords, the captains Unfollow, Fürwitig, and Neidelhart, are afraid that they're going to lose power if another king comes in, and so they succumb to the devil's temptations and hatch a conspiracy to prevent Theuerdank from entering the land. Eventually, the envoy does locate Theuerdank, who Theuerdank, for his part, rejects the devil's teachings, and so he rides off with his herald to answer the invitation from Queen Ehrenreich. And that's the introductory section. Then we have three long sections following that, where at each mountain pass that are held by Fürwitig, Unfollow, and Neidelhart, each villain in turn welcomes Theuerdank and then tries to make sure that he's killed or at least maimed in some plausibly deniable way. Fürwitig, for example, he leads Theuerdank into perils of youthful folly. For example, challenging him to stick his hand into a lion's mouth to prove his bravery and thus gain fame. Unfollow's specialty is the staged hunting accident, along with accidents at sea and incidents involving cannons and a number of other things. And then the third villain, Neidelhart, his treachery involves sending Theuerdank into certain death in battle. Theuerdank, of course, escapes each time unscathed, and after 20 to 50 chapters of this, depending on which villain we're talking about, Theuerdank eventually recognizes that the villains mean him harm, and so they flee from him, fearing for their safety. After all three villains have fled, then Queen Ehrenreich invites Theuerdank to court, but the three villains challenge Theuerdank to a series of jousts on foot and on horse against their champions. So we have this interlude where Theuerdank needs to dispatch each of the champions, one after the other, most of whom survive. And then at that point, the three villains are tried and executed. That makes it possible for Ehrenreich and Theuerdank to be betrothed, but she asks him to undertake a crusade against the heathen enemies who are menacing her land and her people before they marry. And so then we get to this chapter, the second to last chapter, where Theuerdank does agree to undertake a crusade. The crusade is illustrated, but the chapter itself was left blank. And then the work concludes. I have some notes about the translation whenever we'd like to take another look at that. Howard, what do you think would be an opportune time for that?
Sure. Well, I think obviously the thing that we need to sort of emphasize here is that Jonathan's been talking about this as the story of Theuerdank and Ehrenreich, but this is clearly an allegory, and we may continue by talking about the various levels on which we can read the text that is describing an actual journey that Maximilian takes, this wedding journey in 1477 to meet and to eventually wed his bride Mary of Burgundy. And it is told in this form of an allegory, which is, a very, very traditional form indeed. I think another important thing to note too, sort of introductory, is that You know, this whole thing I'd mentioned about Maximilian burnishing, you know, this Memoria issue of burnishing his own image. This is, in some respects, I think, this is an epic. It's an epic journey that's taking place, and for this audience, the first epic that would really come to mind would be the Aeneid, right? The story of a hero leading one city, the city of Troy, to go out on a very, very dangerous journey to encounter all sorts of obstacles, and to, in the end, found and establish a new empire, the Roman Empire, right here. And so Maximilian has a chance to borrow all that imagery and to create a new epic, one of his own family, that starting from their origins in Central Europe and then moving into this area of Flanders, to really establish a new power base and to expand the House of Habsburg, its influence, its geographic reach. So it's in many respects a new version of a new version of the Aeneid. But there are many texts that I think are informing its creation in many different ways that we can read it. And perhaps so we should pass the baton over to our colleague, Professor Elaine Tennant, who may know, who really does know this text the best of all, and has been working with it for many years, for her own observations and some questions that of some broader themes that we may want to pull out, both about the translation and about some of the themes within the work itself.
I was just going to ask Howard if I could toss in a cross question here, because I do want to say, first of all, that this is a so complicated work that I would like, as the outsider on the panel, to jump in and suggest what a fine thing I think the two of you have done, and what a difficult project it was, because I think the two of you together today have managed to make the difficulties of this early modern book a little simpler than all of us have found in trying to interest people in it for a period not just of our lifetimes, but about 150 years. People have been trying to decide what to do with this complicated work. And if I could ask Clayton in just a second to show you what I mean, and why this translation edition that Howard and Jonathan have completed is such a gift to a lot of people. Would you show, please, Clayton, an opening from the original? Thank you. Okay, so this is an opening from the 1517 first edition of Theuerdank. And the typeface in which it is presented has been called the most complicated Western typeface ever created. If we could zoom this, you would see that it is designed to look like a written book hand, and it is very, very sophisticated. The layout is reminiscent of contemporary chronicle manuscripts, which were written with these closely scheduled lines, and then large square illustrations dropped exactly where there was a text break, regardless of the regular layout of the leaf. And then the columns are instead not suggestive of a chronicle layout, but of a high-end, fancy literary manuscript, probably something in verse, and which this is, and perhaps a romance. It's an archaizing kind of layout. Would you now show us what the new edition looks like, please, Clayton? So Jonathan and Howard actually managed to talk Routledge into producing this translation in English in a layout that is sufficiently like the original. So for the first time in a couple of hundred years, we now have the text and the images combined as they were originally, so that people who want to think about how this work was originally designed to be received can do it. From about the 18th century on, people who were interested in this text printed the text by itself, and people who were interested in the images pirated them, moved them around, used them for different texts. And finally, as we come toward the modern period, and people are interested in these as art historical objects, they not only produce the images by themselves, but they produce them without any text at all. And so the design of the work to tell you a story, both in words and in images, has been ruptured for a long time. And the fact that we now have this reunion of the two idioms of this original text in a language that is accessible in English for enthusiasts, art historians, and students reading this text for the first time is just terrific. So my hearty congratulations to all who were involved. I just want to mention quickly and then ask Jonathan to say something about the complexities of producing this originally verse text in English prose of an accessible kind for students. I don't think we've mentioned yet in talking about this that Theuerdank is one of 3 autobiographical projects that Maximilian launched and was heavily involved with during his lifetime. And it's also generally known as the first roman à clef in German. So it's a very open secret to any contemporary audience who this is all about, what kind of claims he's making for himself, and who the other usual suspects are under these cloaking names. Could you say something, Jonathan, about how hard this verse was to present? I should say just quickly, the verse in which this narrative was originally composed is one that is used in Shrovetide plays in the early modern period. It's used in Reformation plays, and it's called Knittelvers. It's a verse that English audiences have some trouble with because we are so used to, in the post-Shakespearean world, nice regular meter, that when we're confronted with one that is regularly irregular, it just seems to us sloppy and not very good. But it was a standard meter in early modern Germany, and that's what this is written in, and that's what Jonathan had to work with. So please, Jonathan, tell us how hard this was.
Okay. Let me take you behind the scenes a bit to show you some of the decisions that went into the translation, from some very low level decisions to some higher level ones. And I am going to share my screen again for a moment so that you can see some of these things. So let's see. So hopefully I'm sharing my screen with you right now. What you're looking at is a modern translation environment with the German text on the left, the translation in the middle, and then various search results on the right. Now, it is possible to translate by staring at one page in German and typing into Microsoft Word in English, but for a 70,000 word work like Theuerdank, I really don't recommend it. You're just giving up too much in terms of accuracy and consistency and efficiency. But going with a modern translation environment it requires some choices just to get started. Is there an electronic text available? If not, how hard is it going to be to get one? In this case, there is an electronic text based on Helga Unger's 1968 edition, but is that electronic text reliable? The solution I hit on was to translate against Unger's edition so that I could build on the work of the most recent scholarship, the most recent edition, and then correct against Goethe's 1878 edition. And then when the text got too mysterious, I would consult the early printed editions and modern scholarly notes. Another thing that this interface forces on you, though, is it forces a very abstract approach to the text. You've probably heard some of the differences in approach between me and Howard, where he's looking at how this text is embedded in history, and as a translator, I'm looking at this very abstract representation of the text. You can see, looking at this interface, that the basic metaphor is the segment, and which we might call a sentence or a smaller or larger meaning unit. But as, not that one, there we go. As you can see, the original editions of Theuerdank were not punctuated. There are not sentences or commas or anything much like them. And so for that segmentation, we're depending on the work of earlier scholars, and you have to perpetually, I had to keep asking myself, do I agree with this? And sometimes I disagreed. I could split and join things as I wanted, but still that's forcing me to make decisions about the text that aren't explicitly made by the text itself. And in terms of translation, there's no universal definition of what makes a translation good or bad, better or worse. And it's still a highly contentious debate. I find the most useful definition is a good translation is one that makes the client happy. And I'm quite serious about that. Now, by client. Well, right. And now I do include among clients scholars who know English and early modern German and are going to be looking for something that we'll call accuracy. But my primary client in this case is I'm thinking of students who are going to be using this in the classroom. And then that informed some basic choices about the translation. When it came to, that was why I opted for prose, because if this needed a verse translation, I'm not the right person for it. And I don't think you could turn this into an adequate verse translation for students. I aimed for an enjoyable, readable prose text for students. When it came to specialized vocabulary for mountaineering or weaponry or hunting, then I would usually opt against archaic or technical terms. Now, a particular challenge of Theuerdank is that all the characters have speaking names, including Theuerdank. And it's not just that they have speaking names, but the text sometimes refer to them or alludes to them. And so at times I had to add a note or an epithet. I couldn't just leave it at something like Neidelhart well deserved that name. I had to add something like Neidelhart, the man of envious hatred, well deserved that name. And then because this was intended for classroom use for students, I want students to be able to discover things in the text and discover some of the various possibilities to read it. If the text and the woodcut are in tension, I don't want to smooth out that tension. I almost want to make sure students can find that tension and let them discover it. And often gesturing towards alternate possibilities for reading ends up taking the form of humor, inviting the contrast between Theuerdank, the ever-victorious hero, on the one hand, and a prince who just can't say no to one more mountain goat hunt, or who has to be saved from disaster by his quick-witted horse, or the brave warrior who, there we go, or the brave warrior who crawls away from an enemy city wall, leaving his dazed and wounded companion to make his own way to safety. So I think that's a pretty good introduction to some of the basic issues that you just have to deal with on a daily basis for translating a work like this.
Jonathan, can I jump in and ask you perhaps to elaborate on one thing that maybe students and others who don't have German sort of might struggle with, but it's actually really quite important to understanding the story. And this is, again, sort of one of the challenges that when we present material that's not in English, and that's these names. And I've encountered it. I did a Czech translation, and how do you handle these Czech names? And, you know, people, we don't think too many people know German, and that many less know even Czech in this period. But what do these names mean? The main character is Theuerdank. We know that's a reference to Maximilian. His lady is Ehrenreich. We know that's Mary of Burgundy. He's got these three guides, these treacherous villains. That what's going on there?
Right. Well, in the case of Theuerdank, it's where a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, because a student might look at that name and think expensive thanks doesn't make a lot of sense.
The literal translation, right?
Right.
A literal modern translation.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. But really, Theuerdank means something like, you know, thoughts of noble virtue, and how you translate any one element is going to require pages of explanation. But something like thoughts of noble virtue, and it's something that does show up in the text as well. Ruhmreich, rich in fame; Ehrenreich, rich in honor. The villains, their speaking names apply to their situation. Unfollow is the easiest to treat. It's recognizable as you know, unfall, accident, mishap. I could circumscribe him as falls into misfortune. Fürwittig is harder. We don't have that sense today of curiosity as a dangerous thing or as a negative thing, but it's a negative form of curiosity. Vorwitz.
One of the things that is challenging about bringing this close to modern students is that the abstract sense of these speaking names is really useful to give background, but it reduces the humorous and sort of representational quality of the original, in that by not having a reductive speaking name like Dudley Do-Right or something to that effect, that you can plunk in each time that given name occurs in the poem, you eliminate some of the tone of the original. And I think your decision to do that is just fine, but in terms of thinking about how a contemporary audience would have heard this, I mean, when they think of somebody like Charles the Bold, the father of Mary of Burgundy, as rich in honor. And could we have real quickly, Clayton, that number 3 illustration, the very first one that we looked at with the king lying beside the stream? No, the single frame, no, number 3, the very first one you showed. Keep going back. We're looking for a single woodcut.
I think I have that one. Let me.
I think yeah, Jonathan has that.
Yeah, let me pull that up. So I will share my screen again.
Sorry to ask you to pull that out of the air.
How's that?
There it is.
Yeah, this one, for example. So contemporary audience looking at this, and they hear that this is King Great Fame or rich in fame, okay? And this is all about his dying beside a stream. When they know, because of the close awareness of the fact that this is an autobiography where Maximilian's presenting his own early bridal quest for Mary of Burgundy, that whole historical episode starts off with this man being killed very brutally in battle, and very bitter battle. And he was, the corpse was then disfigured afterwards, and it was a cause célèbre all over Europe. It turns up in all the chronicles how badly Charles the Bold was, you know, worked on after he had been killed. And so there's a certain kind of tension in the way that this subject, which was well known at the time, is being prettied up here in this propaganda piece by Maximilian. And that's, of course, one thing that, it's just one thing you can't do when you're trying to create a work to be accessible to so many modern audiences. And I think you guys have done a really good job creating something that provides the most original information in the most aspects of the original to a lot of different modern audiences. And so kudos.
It does require some compromises and some trade-offs. I think for contemporary audiences, it would just sound odd. It would be alienating to have king rich in fame and queen rich in honor and so on. Or, especially in the case of the herald, I decided not to treat that as a given name at all. Otherwise, we'd have the herald named Harold. And I just treated it as a job title.
Although you could read it as one of the design features of the original, that all of these very well-known current figures are being caricatured to an extent with their given names.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about some of the, oh, excuse me, Sarah, please.
No, go ahead, Elaine, go ahead.
No. Another voice should be heard from.
Well, I was just going to ask because I think it's so intriguing that, this is the self-propagandizing work that's commissioned by Maximilian to memorialize his own accomplishments, but also his long lineage into the past and the Habsburg family. And so he issues all these editions on paper and on parchment when it comes out, but then he dies 2 years later. But Howard, in your introduction, you talk about how it keeps getting reprinted over and over and over. And in fact, I'm wondering how much is this the sort of popularity that it really struck a chord with audiences, and how much is it the sort of heirs of Maximilian, the later Habsburg, saying, let's keep this thing rolling because we're benefiting from it as well?
Could I take that one?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, it seems to me it does have an astonishing afterlife, but not the one you'd expect. It has many different afterlives. And that, I think, is a feature of the complexity of the original design, which is why I think the presentation in the new edition is really important. So it turns out that this is a story that everybody knows is set in contemporary Central Europe. Everybody knows who the cast of characters is and what this is all about. But it's presented in the visual format of either a romance, looking at the way the pages are laid out, or something that refers also to the chronicles because of the way the illustrations appear. And it's a complicated text. You have basically the introductory part that Jonathan described as the first section, which is basically the bridal quest. It's the sort of tricked up story from January 1477, when Charles the Bold is killed brutally on the battlefield, and the time when Maximilian can get from Austria to Ghent to marry Mary of Burgundy, which is a wedding that takes place in August of the same year. So that's the immediate sort of historical kernel, but that's accomplished pretty quickly, or the setup is in the Theuerdank. And then you get these three sections of the evil opponents, who have these speaking names, and all of the different kinds of oppositions. And so you get the sort of historical story hooked up to an allegory, and then you have these large allegorical sections. And the end of the edition is a key to the illustrations that sort of explains what's going on in the pictures. And when this was received, it turns out that a historian grabs off the explanatory key at the end and plugs that right into the middle of his history of Germany. and he makes it even more empirical than the correcting data in the key of Theuerdank. And then the illustrations are much beloved, and they get grabbed off pretty quickly. And because the printer who did the first edition of Theuerdank went broke producing this elaborate project for Maximilian, as soon as Maximilian was dead, he published it basically a pirated edition of this private work that was only supposed to be for the emperor. He publishes a second edition quickly with a fake printing privilege so he can recoup some of his losses, only he doesn't succeed. And so his inventory is then bought up by another printer, and that printer uses the illustrations variously. People try to copy the combined project, and they do knockoff versions of this in normal type with recut illustrations. And then curiously, some of the illustrations become the models for manuscripts, elaborate manuscripts that are done in the middle of the 16th century. So it has this kind of rippling reception. And then in the 18th century, it's picked up, as Howard was saying, as a narrative that could be compared to classical epics. And it's talked about as a German language Homeric epic. And then in the 19th century, the text is picked up all by itself. And people then also start reproducing the illustrations. And so it's a wild, funny echo that has gone on almost uninterrupted since this thing first appeared.
Yeah, and if I could sort of pick up on that, and I think one of the things that we're seeing in our discussion right here is how this text is how it resonates with all sorts of different communities, whether it's a more literary scholars right here, a historian like myself, but we haven't even talked about the illustrations as well, as art historians are very interested in as well. And circling back to the classroom where this project in many respects originated, we're continuing this process of sort of appropriating this text and trying to pull things out pedagogically as well. It's, why is it significant? What does this tell us? It's, on the one hand, it looks like just a piece of imperial propaganda, but when we look a little bit closer, there are some really important themes that could come out. And I'd be happy to sort of talk about some of those as well, but I'm also happy to let others sort of jump in and answer what other questions there might be.
Yeah, so if there are any joining us in the audience who have a question for anyone on the panel, please do feel free to put that in the chat, and I'll read that out. But while people are thinking about their questions, if you want to proceed with something you wanted to say, Howard, or another question from Elaine, that's fine too.
Right. Okay, let me just give you sort of one example of how I've used the class, how I've used the text in the classroom, and I'll grab the screen in just a minute as well. I think one of the things that is distinctive about this poem, or that jumps to the fore, is that this is a story that takes place out of doors, with a few exceptions, a number of scenes in the beginning, and those towards the end. Most everything that happens is outside. Now, the major activities are really under two big categories. Warfare, we learn a lot about warfare, and I could go on and talk about what this teaches us about early modern warfare and why that's significant. The other is hunting. And Maximilian, we know this as well, really styled himself as a great outdoorsman of this period. And I think it opens up some very interesting thoughts and observations about environmental history in this period. Maximilian, I mean, we certainly should not make him a modern environmentalist. In fact, he did much to reduce the environments of certain animals in the period, from this period. in this period, but he also really did try to conserve certain animals as well, including fish and such. But one of the major themes that I think really plays, and Elaine mentioned right at the beginning, or no, Sarah did when talking about this alpine landscape. We have to remember that this is a story that is taking place during the age of exploration. And while our thoughts normally go towards the West and the exploits of da Gama and Columbus and Magellan and all that, we have to remember that exploration went in other directions too. And Maximilian actually, at part of the Habsburg court, with a number of missions, was pushing towards the East. He had a very important envoy who wrote a critical history of Russia and pushing out towards Siberia. So that was one area of exploration. And then, but most obviously, in terms of the in terms of this text, is the mountains play a significant role in this story, that we see them cropping up all over the place. And this is really, really quite fascinating. Normally, when we think about sort of the history of mountains in particular, sort of the classical notion of what mountains were like, were mountains were places that you're supposed to be afraid. Livy talked about the dreadful Alps. So, you know, this is a place where dragons were, of giants, of all sorts of things that were kind of scary and dangerous. And scholars have felt for generation that, you know, there's a real turning point. Now, of course, we look at mountains as these great places of rest, relaxation, natural beauty and such. And when we're sort of tracking those turns, scholars have often pointed to the 18th century, the age of Romanticism and all this. But Maximilian actually shows us that some of the changes were occurring much earlier. And there's a type of curiosity about this world and some of his adventures that he goes through of handling, you know, lightning strikes. You know, when you're on the top of the mountain and you get hit by a storm, this is something that you got to watch out for. Avalanches, all other sort of different types of disasters that can happen out of doors are things that one really needs to be aware of. But there's also a type of a curiosity that's here. We have pictures of him crossing glaciers, and the attention that the artists give to things like the crampons that they were wearing, or some of the plants, or some of the animals, I think are really very telling. And it's also significant that Maximilian's court, that one of the artists most closely connected to Maximilian's court, has often been attributed to the birth of the landscape. You know, we take, you know, the landscape as an artistic genre for granted, but it has its own origin, and Albrecht Altdorfer has often been pointed to as the father of the landscape. So this attention to nature is something that's really kind of fun to pull out, and is really quite significant in this text.
Thanks, Howard. Now the questions are pouring in as we get near the end of our hour, but you actually, one of the questions from James Grisak was about the book's images. So you've started to address who the artists were at the time. And there are other questions about both the original edition, and is the first edition still available to scholars, but also the initial audience. So with low levels of literacy, who is it expected in this time period beyond the elite might be interacting with the text and the images?
This is a really interesting question. First of all, not only is the original still in existence, there are many originals still in existence. And that's one of the fascinating things about the history of this work. It was the first edition, so-called, the 1517 printing, was technically a private printing. It was not a public edition. It was created for Maximilian himself He had it done to be given to people on his death, and these great volumes, and we don't have a fixed number on how many of them there were. People say between 200 and 300 were done for the emperor, but these things were actually produced. They were mostly stored in great chests until Max died 2 years later. But there were all, and they were printed on vellum. The first 100 or so were done on vellum, which was a really tricky printing process. This vellum is wonderful for writing. It's not a good medium to print on. So the fact that they were able finally to get that many done was a feat in itself. There were copies of the 1517 edition also printed on paper. So those were mostly sequestered until 1519. He gave a copy, he had given to the wonderful woodcut artist Hans Borkmeyer, who did several of the illustrations for Theuerdank. He had him given a copy of his own before his death. I think Peutinger may have had a copy, but for the most part, it didn't become publicly available until 1519, when the printer, Hans Schönsberger, did this, what is called the second edition. It's really the first official edition because it's the first one that was available publicly. And so there are numbers of both the 1517 edition in libraries all over the world, and also of the 1519 edition. And some of them are hand tinted in the period, some of them with gold hatching over the gouache and transparent watercolor that was used on them. But there are lots of them around. And the question about who the intended audience was, not clear that the intended audience and the intended recipients are quite the same. The people to whom the first 200 or 300 for whom they were intended were people in Max's entourage that he was trying to keep bound in affection to the Habsburg project. The printed ones that Schönsberger then sold more widely afterwards went into all kinds of collections. And there was a copy of this in Christopher Columbus's library. They, you know, I think Fugger certainly had a copy. And, you know, they went around Europe, and there are a lot of them in Britain, and there are a fair number of them in the United States, and certainly in France also.
Well, we're getting close to the 7 o'clock hour here. There's a question I didn't get to about the other changes you may have made in targeting this modern audience of students, in addition to putting it into prose. So unfortunately, that we will, those who want to hang around afterwards when we end the official book club can do so. So we may hear about that then. But I do want to commend Jonathan and Howard on what really is, as Elaine said, a beautiful edition that can be used by students or read by really anyone who's interested in this historical tale. So I want to thank Howard and Jonathan and Elaine for sharing this with us, or taking us on this journey. Thank all of you for joining us on this journey. It's been recorded, and so if you signed up, you'll get a link with the recording that you can watch again or share with others. And our next meeting you'll get an invitation to is November 17th at the noon hour instead of the evening hour, when Giancarlo Casale, a professor in the history department, will share his book Prisoner of the Infidels, the memoir of an Ottoman Muslim in 17th century Europe. So we'll continue with the theme of early modern books and tales of adventure and terrains and journeys. Clayton, I think we'll put into the chat if any of you are interested in supporting the history department, particularly our graduate students who will be producing the books that will feature in the future editions of the book club. You're certainly welcome to do so. And then, as I said, as we close out the official time for the book club, those of you who just want to stay on the Zoom for a little bit and unmute and greet our panelists or ask them a few extra questions, you're welcome to do so. But thank you again for a wonderful journey here with this epic tale.
Thank you. Glad I could be here.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
It was certainly a pleasure to be with all of you.